Okay, thank you very much, KD. This is Mubilu Musoke with Democratization of Africa, the case of Uganda in comparative perspective. Last time, during the last conversation, I ended with the problem of the army and democratization. NRM has a political dogma which is taught at Kyankwanzi, according to which the army is an essential ingredient of the political system and democracy in this particular case. According to NRM political dogma taught at Kyankwanzi Political School, democracy is based on the premise that the army as an institution is an essential component of the political process. This means that the representation of the army in parliament was an important issue. Historically, under NRM, the army supposedly played the unique role of liberation, and therefore the argument went the army was entitled to play an active role in politics as the ultimate guardian of democracy. This, however, we think is a contradiction, because the army is an institution, a part of the executive, and should not be politicized. It should be under the control of the civilian government. So you cannot talk about guarding the army being the guardian of democracy. The army is supposed to be the guardian of the territory of the state of Uganda and not the democratic process. The erroneous assumption on which this NRM military political dogma was based is explained by one of the architects of the 1995 Constitution of Uganda, Justice Benjamin J. Odoki, who chaired the Constitutional Commission and was also the Chief Justice of Uganda for a long time, a position he held after being appointed by Yoweri K. Museveni. The NRM military political dogma, as I call it, is called domestication of the military. And I'm going to quote Benjamin Odoki. Benjamin Odoki wrote that the army has played an active role in the politics of Uganda since independence. The gun, rather than the vote, has dominated political change. The army was thus associated with dictatorship, political and constitutional instability, as well as with gross violation of human rights, especially through state terrorism. There was therefore a need to change the character and the role of the army to make it support democratic institutions, defend the country, and be transformed into a pro-people army. It was for these reasons, Odoki goes on to say, or to write, that it was proposed that the military needed to be domesticated. During the constitutional making exercise, it was argued that the military needed to be integrated into the civilian life in order to be part of the development process. The army should be productive and should assist whenever there are national disasters. It was also agreed that during the transition to democracy should be represented in the parliament and be part of the democratic process because of its historical role in liberating the country. It was therefore found imperative to address the issue of the military in the constitution for the first time in Uganda. The name of the army was changed from National Resistance Army to Uganda People's Defense Forces to reflect its new role and character. That ends the quotation from Benjamin Odoki. This quotation purports to make a case for the military to participate in politics, or the politicization or domestication of the military as part of democratization. It is, on the contrary, I must argue, the opposite. The army should not be involved in politics. On the other hand, democratization's primary objective is to protect human rights, especially those which protect equality and political freedom. Rights would mean nothing on their own without the concept of values such as liberty, truth, and justice, which people want to protect and enhance their self-determination with individual and collective security. Values are not static. They vary with and get transformed by the process of social change. It would seem that as the economy creates new values through the process of economic development, new values emerge in society. Hence, there is a link between economic development and democratization. In the theory of democratization, the economic determinant for democratization is not clearly spelled out. The question is, to what extent is a mere increase in GDP, or gross national product, a causal factor in the process of democratization? For example, how would one explain the absence of democracy in the Arab countries which have high gross national product, such as Saudi Arabia, Iraq before the invasion, United Arab Emirates, and Kuwait? We talked about these countries in our preliminary conversations about the theories of democratization. According to Huntington, the economic growth / development creates economic conditions favorable to democratization, or levels of economic development supportive of development, cause forms of politics to emerge when economic prosperity interacts with the traditional values to bring about democratization. To what extent does Huntington's vague explanation help us formulate a credible prognosis for democratization of Uganda, especially now that the economy is rapidly deteriorating Will the impoverished class heed the message for democratization more easily? On the other hand, the Arab countries with the gross national product, with a very high gross national product, they should be contrasted with South Africa, where in spite of poverty, the African population suffered from, they were able to confront the apartheid regime from the beginning of apartheid in 1948. The depressing economic circumstances of the Africans in South Africa did not prevent them from fighting for equality and democracy under the apartheid regime. The same may be said about the independence movements throughout Africa. They evolved and emerged under similar circumstances as the South African resistance to apartheid. In fact, these African governments further discredit Museveni's sectarian theory. The key to solve this puzzle seems to reside in the idea of human values we have referred to above. Values are also directly linked to political philosophy. It is political philosophy that clarifies and dispenses values in the political system. We noted in a previous conversation that Ugandans are not guided by political philosophy in their political actions. This is a serious obstacle to democratization. Our weakness in confronting Museveni and the NRM system is partly caused by our political prostitution, because our allegiance to political parties is not based on political philosophy or a belief in certain human values, but it is primarily driven by the greed for power. This greed for power is currently detectable in our politics. As the NRM regime weakens, the so-called freedom fighters proportionately multiply. Some of us have opposed NRM regime from the beginning in 1986. We welcome all of you who are waking up to this reality, as long as you are genuinely committed to the cause of liberty and justice. However, when we look at the state in which the political parties operate without a political philosophy, our prognosis looks bad, very, very bad. This is because democratization has to go through a transitional phase known as consolidation in political science, if such a science is scientific at all. The consolidation period is going to be difficult because political parties in Uganda are not built on political philosophies. They are not held together by specific philosophical core values. The absence of political philosophy is a problem because it means that the political parties lack internal solidarity, which in turn makes them weak at the electoral polls. This problem is clearly manifested in the fact that many party candidates or who lose in the primary elections opt to run as independents, who oppose the official candidates and their own political parties. So I decided that I will today make a detour to give you the pathology of Ugandan political parties and why they are part of the problems in our process of the democratization, and especially will be a problem in the consolidation of democracy in Uganda. There are two questions to ask and answer in this conversation. What do I mean by political philosophy? When and why did political parties lose their political philosophy, if they had any to begin with? The first question is much easier to answer. We are trying to avoid the term ideology because it tends to be too dogmatic. In fact, political philosophies eventually crystallize into dogmatic ideologies. This is true in all political systems, whether they are democratic or not. It is the nature of ideology. In U.S., for example, cutting taxes and small government are now dogmatic articles of political faith for conservative Republicans since the Reagan presidency. Regardless of the consequences of cutting taxes and their impact on the reality of social justice, equality, and the welfare of all citizens, or the nature of the problem to be solved in the economy. The presumption in this political dogma of cutting taxes and small government is that every economic problem can be effectively solved by simply cutting taxes and making the government smaller. In the process of debating the issues, economic theory is replaced by a dogmatic ideology which is viewed by its believers as the only cure or solution to every economic, social, and political problem. In communist and socialist systems, suppression of political freedom was seen as necessary, a necessary means of eliminating class conflict and exploitation by capital for the private ownership of the means of production. This led to the dogmatic dictatorship of the proletariat, which is wiped out the elements of political freedom. The end justifies the means at any price. The result was political oppression under Hitler and apartheid regimes in Germany and South Africa, respectively. Racial purity or separation and cultural identity were seen as the only solution to every political problem in society faced. Racism justified both apartheid and the racial segregation. I'm giving these examples to illustrate the difference between political philosophy and dogmatic ideologies. Nevertheless, it is important to distinguish between a dogmatic ideology, and a political philosophy. Most post-colonial regimes in Africa started off by embracing socialist philosophy as a political weapon, originally justified as a means of democratization of the political system that had achieved independence. Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana and Julius Nyerere in Tanzania were at the forefront of this movement. Soon, the philosophy crystallized into a rigid ideology that is repressive and incompatible with the basic tenets of democracy and political freedom. One-party political systems were introduced, and as a result, political freedom withered and disappeared, replaced by oppressive political tyranny rooted in an inflexible ideology under which political opposition was officially banned. This happened in Ghana, in Tanzania, Guinea, Uganda, Kenya, Mozambique, and many other African countries. The transition from philosophy to ideology in Africa was mainly caused and propelled by, or even encouraged by, the existence of the Cold War. Under the circumstances, political polarization was inevitable in the 1960s, and so was the movement from socialist philosophy to rigid socialist ideology that tolerated no political philosophy, no political freedom, rather. A political philosophy, however, is important in politics because it rationalizes political action and unifies membership of a political party into a coherent political group or organization with a purpose. Without a philosophy, a political party is like a rudderless ship. It becomes a congregation of individuals without a common purpose, vision, or destiny. A political philosophy tells you why a specific political action is necessary and even justifiable. In that sense, a political philosophy is a uniting factor in politics. Unity which many are demanding today within the Ugandan community, opposed to the movement, and NRM must therefore be built around a general political philosophy. And in the case of Uganda, that philosophy must promote peace, liberty, and justice for the protection of human rights, regardless of the political party or belief. These are the elements Uganda has lacked during the political turmoil and dictatorship. The political philosophy gives people a cause or motivation to pursue specific political actions. That's why it is very important during democratization. That is why, why the repressive policies of Obote and Museveni crippled democratization in Uganda, and as a result have had a negative long-term and sociological consequence on democratization. It caused both political apathy and lack of unity among Ugandans, thereby making it difficult to organize Ugandans or increasing their inability to take a conscious political action to struggle effectively against dictatorship. In Uganda, under Obote, Amin and Museveni, because of the denial of political freedom, the people were forced to act as individuals rather than as groups or associations who shared a philosophy or common purpose, because autonomous groups like political parties and trade unions were forbidden to exist except when they were affiliated to the regime in power. This is the time when political parties lost their political identities, because such identities were dangerous both to the believer and the dictator in power. Trade unions played an important role similar to that of the political parties in South Africa in the war against apartheid, because they were separate and independent from the apartheid regime. I want to pause here for a few minutes, and I'll be back and continue the conversation. Thank you.
Listening to Voice of Uganda Radio, the mouthpiece of all Ugandans, wherever they may be, to voice their problems without fear of any retribution. The Voice of Uganda Radio works in sync with FADU, the Federalist Alliance of Democracy and Development in Uganda. FADU is an organization that was formed to work as a platform for all Ugandans at home and outside, to work synergistically to liberate our mother Uganda from the ruthless invaders that have sucked it dry. Therefore, FADU invites all able Ugandans to act now and save the Ugandan humanity that is being slaughtered, destroyed, and robbed by a few people unworthy to call themselves Ugandans. Many people are crying for action in Uganda as they languish in misery. FADU echoes their cries by making the loudest alarm to everyone to join FADU, not tomorrow or the next day, but today. The number to join is 408-904-7038. The email is info@fadu.org.
ekolaganira wamu n'ekibiina ekya Federalist Alliance of Democracy and Development in Uganda, FADU. Ebigendererwa by'ekibiina kino kuzza mirembe, enkolagana ey'awamu, obwenkanya, okuggyawo enkola y'omwana waani, n'okusosola mu mawanga, okutulugunya, okulya enguzi, ebikudde ejjembe mu Uganda. Era kirwanirira okuzza enfuga eya demokrasiya mu Uganda. Ekibiina kino kye kisookedde ddala okukubiriza buli muntu yenna okukyegattako awatali kusosola mu mawanga n'enzikiriza oba ekitundu omuntu kyalimu mu nsi yonna. Kino kye kiseera twegatte tusobole okuzza obupya ensi yaffe Uganda edobonkanyizibwa. Buli eyandyagadde okwegatta ku kibiina kya FADU kuba ennamba eno: 1-8-4-7-3-8 oba weeyambise email info@fadu.org.
Fellow citizens, we call upon you to practice resistance and protest against Museveni. We call upon you to oppose strongly the Museveni government, which is responsible for the downfall of Uganda. It is important to know that Museveni is afraid of the millions of people who are living for that day, for the light of day when Uganda will be liberated from his dictatorial regime. Fellow citizens, it's been 24 years of dictatorship. We should all know that at present our drive for freedom has already grown so strong that Museveni has already begun to change his tactics.
Thank you. After that short interval, I am back, and I was talking about the value of political philosophy in democratization and how it played a big role in the overthrow of a regime like apartheid. Under Idi Amin's regime, if you may recall, the extreme point of political repression was reached in Uganda. Merely engaging in politics was a severely punishable capital crime under Amin, and politics was specifically forbidden, if you can imagine that. And Obote too, and under Museveni, participation in politics was strictly controlled from above and had to take place only within a single political organization or the movement. In 1986, the NRM introduced the ubiquitous individual merit principle. Again, this was one way of suppressing political philosophy. Its consequence was to isolate political actors into individuals who could neither appeal to political philosophy for their actions nor to political organization to give them political support and strength. In spite of the gloomy past, however, blame for political damage inflicted on Ugandans, their nation and political system at this time, and the perpetuation of the impact should be placed where it truly belongs. At this moment in our liberation struggle from dictators, there is no excuse why the leaders of political parties in Uganda do not shake off the old political shackles and lead their political parties with a specific political philosophy. Today, political parties in Uganda are philosophically indistinguishable, which means they are not true or healthy political parties, in my opinion. Therefore, that poses a serious problem for democratization. And I'll try to illustrate this point later on. The leaders of the political parties should tell us why a particular political party is better for the purpose of democratization of Uganda than another, namely, in fostering peace, protecting liberty, and advancing the cause of justice in Uganda. Let us begin by looking at UPC. The UPC, when we look at the one major party, which is UPC, we did so in order to illustrate the foregoing points I've made. UPC is the most interesting because it was in power at the time Uganda achieved independence and has produced offsprings such as UPM, now deceased, and grandchildren NRM and FDC. Yet, it is still politically crippled by lack of a specific political philosophy to provide it with a clear political vision. UPC, however, had a concrete political philosophy in the 1960s, whose components have since been either abandoned, repudiated, or rendered irrelevant by history and political circumstances. Today, UPC does not have a rational political philosophy that we can point to. Consequently, even Obote's improbable political resurrection seems unlikely to revive UPC to its original political glory in the 1960s, when Obote's personality triumphantly dominated Ugandan politics. Because today UPC has no political philosophy beyond the memories of its past leader and the founder, A. Milton Obote. In fact, some UPC leaders are now embarrassed by the political philosophy they professed in the 1960s. UPC has completely abandoned the 5 components which originally constituted UPC political philosophy in the late 1960s and early 1970s, because these components are either no longer rational or compatible with political freedom. In search of UPC's political philosophy, we shall look at 3 sources. These are the history or supposed origin of the party, its avowed objectives, and finally the documents authored by the leader of the party and the members of the party collectively at their annual conferences. Yoga Adola argues that, quote, the UPC is a political party which began with the aim of seeking to redress the minority nationalities of Uganda from the historic dominance and humiliation of the Baganda, unquote. This quotation comes from Yoga Adola's essay posted on UPC Party Network under the title of Marxism and the Uganda People's Congress. Even if we assumed the factual validity of this statement by Yoga Adola, which I do not, it sounds more like a political tactic than a statement of a political vision of the party. It is true that we can tease out a philosophical element of a party from its main objectives. However, in this particular case, the alleged objective was more of a political tactic than a philosophical vision. This example partly explains why political parties in Uganda are short on political philosophy. Political parties in Uganda need to be rescued from this unhealthy political condition. The history of UPC should help us to understand the nature and seriousness of the problem we are trying to explain, which deals or affects democratization. By philosophy of a political party, we mean fundamental reasons why a political party exists, both in the short and long runs. This includes how it justifies its existence in the political system. Seeking or capturing political power is not part of the political philosophy, because all political parties compete for political power. being nationalistic is not a political philosophy, because all well-established political parties tend to be nationalistic. Moreover, in Uganda, Article 71 of the Constitution provides that, quote, every political party shall have a national character, unquote. The political party, by possessing a national character, does not automatically confer on the party a unique political philosophy. The underlying reasons for which political power is sought and used are to improve society. These reasons should contain the philosophical vision of the party. In order for political philosophy of the party to be rational in a democratic system, they must be compatible with political freedom. That explains why political parties which were not rational, such as National Party of South Africa and the Communist Party of USSR, became extinct because they were not rational. They could not be sustainable politically. A party which exists simply to promote the interests of the minorities at a particular time, as Adola suggests UPC did, falls short of fulfilling the fundamental objectives of protecting the interests of all the members of society. Ultimately, a rational, durable political philosophy of a political party must address the interests of all the people if the party is going to be successful. Now, it is clear why we believe a political party, in order to be effective and successful, must be guided by a national political philosophy that embraces the interests of all the people in society. The implications of this argument is that a political philosophy of a political party, if it is to treat people equally, must avoid categorizing them into good and bad groups of people, of citizens. The only exception is discrimination on any basis whatsoever. Another source we can look at in order to ascertain UPC's political philosophy is a document known as the Common Man's Charter, with appendices. It was published with 3 appendices. Hereafter we shall refer to it as the Charter. The Charter has 3 appendices: the Proposals for National Service, document number 2, the communication from the Chair of the National Assembly on the 20th April 1970, and lastly the Labor Day speech on the May 1st, that's the Labor Day speech of 1970. These 3 documents and the Charter is what Mazuri once called documentary radicalism. To put this, this document, the Common Man Charter, and the appendices in the context, we must remember that they were written after the 1966 political crisis and the enactment of 1967 Constitution, which is commonly referred to as the Republican Constitution, because it abolished the monarchies throughout Uganda. The Charter was basically an explanation and justification of the 1966 crisis and provided the rationale for the enactment of the 1967 Constitution. As it will become apparent, the Charter nationalized the UPC political philosophy and made it a political philosophy for Uganda as a nation. A political party should not have a philosophy that embraces the nation itself. It should be for political action of the activists within the party. We identify 5 components of the original UPC political philosophy which emerged at the end of 1960s. These components are socialism, a one-party political system, a unitary state, republicanism as the antithesis of feudalism, and the struggle against imperialism. These components of UPC political philosophy were actually originally coherent and consistent with each other, as we shall demonstrate soon. By the end of the 1960s, socialism had swept across Africa like a wildfire. Even the capitalist system, such as the one in Kenya, professed some degree of socialism in its session of paper number 10 as good in their policies. Socialism was conceived at the time as the best decolonization device of the post-colonial political system in Africa. It was therefore not an accident that Milton Obote advocated socialism as the best means to tackle African problems such as poverty and development after independence. Moreover, Obote was not the first to do so. The adoption of socialism in Uganda was hardly an original idea, but it was an idea Obote believed in from earlier on in his political career. Section 1 of the Charter made it clear that, quote, for the realization of the real meaning of independence, namely that the resources of the country, material and human, exploited for the benefit of all the people of Uganda in accordance with the principles of socialism. That's a quotation of Section 1 of the Common Man's Charter. However, the aims and objectives of UPC, which were also incorporated in the Charter, included, quote, to plan Uganda's economic development in such a way that the government, through parastatal bodies, the cooperative movement, private companies, individuals in industry, commerce and agriculture will effectively contribute to increased production to raise the standard of living in the country, that is the country of Uganda, unquote. It is clear from the statement quoted above that Obote's socialism was of the ambiguous type, that is, philosophically opaque. If you are in favor of socialism and you declare yourself explicitly as anti-capitalist, why should you at the same time encourage private companies and individuals in industry, commerce and agriculture to participate actively in the economic production process? Even worse, why would you, on May 1st, 1970, announce that as from today, all import and export business will be transacted by parastatal bodies only? Creation and reliance on parastatal bodies is one of those philosophical visions that created inefficient and corrupt state capitalism in Africa. It was eventually reversed by privatization of the parastatal bodies under the NRM regime in order on orders of the World Bank and the IMF. The socialist component of UPC political philosophy was, therefore, eventually politically nullified. The other components, as we shall see later, under the different political circumstances, suffered a similar fate of either nullification or repudiation, thus leaving UPC as a party without a philosophy or a coherent ideology. Although at the time Obote's government was overthrown on January 25, 71, Obote had not officially declared a de jure one-party regime. His policies and rhetoric were sufficient to indicate that Uganda was headed for a one-party political system. As early as 1964, Obote had argued that the need for national unity required the existence of a one political system, a one-party political system. In addition, Obote was a socialist. As a socialist, he argued that the idea of multi-parties is typically Western and rooted in capitalism, which he had personally rejected. In fact, Section 8 of the Charter sent out a typically ambiguous hint. The party, the section says, has always made it clear to the people that the only acceptable and practical meaning of October 9 is that the people of Uganda must move away from the ways of the mental attitudes of the colonial past, move away from the hold of tribal and other forms of factionalism and the power of vested interests, and accept that the problems of poverty, development, and nation building can and must be tackled on the basis of one country, one people. The strategy laid down in this charter aims at the strengthening the fundamental objective of the party, Obote declared in the charter. Moreover, a one-party regime was philosophically compatible with African socialist ideology. Obote did not have to make a convincing argument to justify a one-party political system. UPC leaders in general, however, although not enthusiastically, nevertheless embraced Obote's socialist philosophy at the time. If socialism and one-party regime were presumed good for unity and development in post-colonial Africa, a unitary political structure was seen as the most suitable political tool to implement socialism and unite the people of diverse ethnicities. When the UPC proposes a policy or program on behalf and for the benefit of the people of Uganda, the meaning of the phrase people of Uganda is always clear and definite. It is one people under one government in one country. That is Obote's slogan, which comes from Section 14 of the Charter, the Common Man's Charter. That sentence, which I have just quoted, was an explicit rejection of federalism as enacted in the 1962 Constitution, and an endorsement of the unitary, highly centralized political system enacted in the 1967 Constitution, designed for political control from the center, often mistaken for nationalism. Unfortunately, at the time the Charter was written, there was no objection or realization by the UPC leaders that their political philosophy was incompatible with the protection of human rights of the citizens of Uganda, such as self-determination and the right to associate, which were being violated by UPC political philosophy. The fourth component of UPC's political philosophy was republicanism. This component of UPC political philosophy divided the country into two hostile segments. Republicanism stood for the abolition of monarchies and, as a result, was bitterly opposed by those who preferred to preserve their cultural institutions, which, incidentally, were protected under international law. And Article 1 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights provides that, quote, all peoples have the right of self-determination. By virtue of the right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. That's the Section 1 of the International Covenant on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights, to which Uganda is a party. Republicanism was uniquely designed to deal with the local Ugandan political problems. The philosophical premise of republicanism in Uganda featured widely in the Charter. It constituted the core of UPC political philosophy. And I quote, republicanism in Uganda must, like the political independence of Uganda, is now a reality. But the demand and struggle for Uhuru has no end. This is part of life and a part of the inalienable right of man. It is also the cornerstone of progress and of liberty of the individual. The basis of his prosperity and the hallmark of his full and effective participation in the affairs of his country. October 9, 1962, therefore, was the beginning of a much greater struggle of many dimensions along the road to the goal of full Uhuru. The Republican status, therefore, has taken Uganda further towards the goal of full Uhuru. It must not be accepted, however, that our new status by itself is sufficient, or that it has removed exploitation and has brought full Uhuru. We realize that it is an advance towards the goal of full Uhuru, but because we are also convinced that more has to be done. This charter, the Common Man Charter, has been adopted, and its strategy is, in our view, a logical development from the fact that we have been moving away from the hold of feudal power since 1966. For so long as the feudal power was a factor in the politics and the economy of Uganda, it could not be disregarded. Thus, the reason for this charter. With the removal of the feudal factor from our political and economic life, we need to do two things. First, we must not allow the previous position of the feudalists to be filled by the neo-feudalists. Secondly, we must move away from circumstances which may give birth to neo-feudalism or generate feudalistic mentality. The move to the left is the creation of a new political culture and a new way of life, whereby the people of Uganda as a whole, their welfare and their voice in the national government and in other local authorities are paramount. It is therefore both anti-feudalism and anti-capitalism. That quotation comes from Section 7, 10, and 11 of the Common Man's Charter. Now, I'm quoting this extensively because I take it very seriously that political philosophy is very important, but it has to be rational. I told you that the National Party in South Africa is extinct, and the Communist Party in the Soviet Union is extinct. The only reason they are extinct is because they were not rational. They did not recognize freedom. And as I pointed out, this element of the UPC philosophy of republicanism was divisive because it divided the Ugandan people between the feudalists and the non-feudalists, the progressives and the neo-feudalists. And that could not stand the test of time. So we must be careful when we are talking about political philosophy. It better be rational. Some commentators of these issues, such as Yoga Dola, regard republicanism as articulated in the Charter as a part of the process of democratization. We reject this view. You can have democratic systems under monarchical political systems, such as in Japan and the United Kingdom. What is important for a democracy to exist is the protection of political freedom, which the UPC political philosophy attempted to wipe out under the guise of republicanism. The last important component of UPC political philosophy of the 1960s was the so-called struggle against imperialism. By struggle against imperialism, most African leaders in the 60s meant safeguarding nationalism against the interests of the capitalist Western powers and institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF, which they later on fully embraced and thereby repudiated that philosophical element. The strategy of the struggle entailed the lack of cooperation with the West. For all the practical purposes, however, the struggle against imperialism perished with the Cold War. after condemning feudalism and abolishing the monarchies under the Republican Constitution, it made sense politically for Obote to assail imperialism as the enemy from without. Moreover, a one-party regime was partly rationalized on the ground that imperialists could use or manipulate political parties by infiltrating the political system in order to steal national secrets and undermine nationalism. The condemnation of capitalism was also based on similar premises and, of course, misguided. Imperialism, by the way, one of the people who shouted most loudest during that time was Yoweri Museveni. I know it because we debated a lot in East African University, in Makerere, Dar es Salaam, and in Nairobi. We debated them. I know what Museveni stood for then, although he was masquerading or has told us that he was a member of DP. You couldn't be a member of DP and utter the same things he was uttering. Imperialism and capitalism were in fact presumed to be inseparable. The logic of a socialist one-party political system made political sense under the circumstances. Everything seemed to fall in place. The only question to ask is whether UPC political philosophy was rational and therefore could endure the test of time. I think you know the answer to this question I'm posing here. History has, however, has reversed all 5 components that constituted UPC political philosophy. In the mid-60s, UPC clearly embraced a socialist ideology. But when Obote came back to power in 1980, he disavowed the socialist ideology by implication as he expediently implemented the structural adjustment and the liberalization policies dictated by the IMF. This would seem to coincide unequivocally that the rhetoric against capitalism and imperialism had been totally abandoned. During Obote II, the one-party philosophy was explicitly repudiated. In 1980, Obote himself demanded and participated in a multi-party electoral process. What is not clear is whether Obote had any second thoughts or regrets for abolishing the monarchies. In any case, the issue is now moot. Monarchies were restored by law and recognized under the 1995 Constitution. The people made a democratic political decision on that issue. The 5 components of UPC political philosophy we have discussed have been overtaken by political events. It does not appear that they can be revived. However, UPC as a political party still exists. The question is, what is UPC's political philosophy? In a recent interview on Voice of Uganda Radio, the speaker asked the leader of UPC, Dr. Oraro, what his political philosophy was. In his answer, Otunu made it clear that UPC remains a party of the common man, committed to the unity of Uganda and Pan-Africanism. In his presentation, Otunu made it clear that the 1966 crisis must be dealt with directly and truthfully. Quote, there should be no taboos, he declared. Otunu believes that the 1966 crisis was an intra-UPC crisis beginning from the conflict between Ibingira and Kakonge in 1964. Otunu also pointed out that the relationship between Buganda and Uganda needs addressing. It is not clear whether Otunu believes in the same Republican component of the UPC of 1960s. The history of UPC, however, is a good example to illustrate the dangers of personalizing political institutions. Obote remained the leader of UPC in exile in Zambia, even though UPC was still functioning as a political party in Uganda. Democratization is fundamentally incompatible with the personalization of political institutions, a problem which currently NRM is seriously suffering from. The more fundamental question that has not been answered is whether Obote genuinely changed his socialist political philosophy to capitalism or was compelled to act pragmatically as he did by the dictates of political expediency in order to hold on to political power. As far as I am aware, Obote left no memoirs from which we can confidently answer the question. UPC did not only lose the core of its political philosophy, but it has split up into other independent political parties. How, for example, can we distinguish FDC, NRM, and UPC, especially given the fact that the leaders of the three parties were at one point in the past members of the same original political party, UPC? In other words, why should anybody join any of these three political parties in preference to the other two parties? Is pointing at the leader of the party sufficient to persuade a person to join a political party? We should judge political parties by the political philosophy they profess, not by the transient personality of the leader or the political party. Now, we know why political party needs a rational political philosophy. I will pause again here for just a few minutes, and I'll be back in a few minutes. Thank you.
We call upon people to participate. Fellow citizens, we call upon you to practice resistance and protest against Museveni. We call upon you to oppose strongly the Museveni government, which is responsible for the downfall of Uganda. It is important to know that Museveni is afraid of the millions of people who are living for that day, for the light of day when Uganda will be liberated from his dictatorial regime. Fellow citizens, it's been 24 years of dictatorship. We should all know that at present our drive for freedom has already grown so strong that Museveni has already begun to change his tactics. We call upon people to participate, to organize silent stand-ins for a free Uganda. We call upon people to demonstrate that we're abroad, people in responsible positions, politicians, only to act in the service of peace, justice, and freedom for Uganda. We call upon people to use all legal and imaginative means and methods in order to ensure peace, justice, and freedom for Uganda. We call upon people from the north and south, from the east and west, and yes, from the central province of Uganda to be loyal to one another. We must preserve our loyalty to human dignity. We call upon people once again not to wait until it is too late to begin thinking about a free Uganda. We call for a new attitude. Arise, fellow citizens, arise. Let us fight for a free Uganda. Museveni must go. Fellow citizens, we call upon you to practice resistance and protest against Museveni. We call upon you to oppose strongly the Museveni government, which is responsible for the downfall of Uganda. It is important to know that Museveni is afraid of the millions of people who are living for that day, for the light of day when Uganda will be liberated from his dictatorial regime. Fellow citizens, it's been 24 years of dictatorship. We should all know that at present our drive for freedom has already grown so strong that Museveni has already begun to change his tactics. We call upon people to participate, to organize silent stand-ins for a free Uganda. We call upon people to demonstrate that we're tired of him. We call upon government.
I'm now back for the second part of this conversation on democratization of Africa, the case of Uganda in a comparative perspective. I've dwelt for some time on this issue of political philosophy because I believe it is very important. We may be too excited that overthrowing Museveni may bring democracy, but if our political parties are defective and they don't have political philosophy, rational political philosophies, the problem of democratization is going to be much tougher. And let me conclude my thoughts on UPC. After Oraro Tunu took over as leader of UPC, many of the UPC so-called big guns walked out over from UPC and joined the NRM. The question is why? Were they bribed? As the rumor mill chats points out. But how can one be bribed in order to change a political philosophy? Either they sacrificed it on the altar of expediency, or greed had seized their instincts for desperate political survival. In other words, I've been talking about corruption. Now you can see how our political system is corrupted. And I'm trying to expose this because it is important for us to understand that corruption is not only stealing government money, it is also part of political behavior. These people who crossed over from UPC to NRM, did they change their political philosophy, assuming they had any in the first place? Or they simply saw no philosophical difference between UPC and the NRM, because both parties are committed to the same political goals, and therefore they could change allegiance as they wished without experiencing any philosophical discomfort or embarrassment. In any case, UPC right now has no explicit political philosophy, as that I am aware of, to distinguish it from NRM clearly. Much as the leaders of the two parties, Olaro Tunu and Yoweri Museveni, as personalities may be at loggerheads. Those who did not walk out of UPC seem to resolve their political differences with the threats of clenched fists rather than polite philosophical argument and political persuasion. I'm referring to the confrontation between Akena and Olaro Tunu, for those of you who can remember it. The history of UPC is a good illustration of the role of rational political philosophy, or lack of it thereby, in organizing a political party. UPC is a product of the independence movement. The independence movement produced several political parties, each aspiring to succeed the colonial regime. Under colonialism, of course, there was no political freedom. But the nostalgia of those old enough reminds them that under colonialism, there was no political freedom, but there was personal security and peace. No rampant corruption to impoverish the community or the state was tolerated. So, as soon as political freedom was grudgingly tolerated by the colonial regime during the decade of the transition to independence between 1950 and 1960, many political parties suddenly emerged from the ground like political mushrooms of different types. The Uganda National Congress and the Uganda National Union were some of the political parties which emerged in the 50s. UPC is the result of the merger of two of these pre-independence political parties, Uganda National Congress, UNC led by Musazi, and Uganda People's Union, UPU, led by Obote. It would be delusion, of course, for anyone to say that the pre-independence political parties had a concrete political philosophy. They equally suffered from the political kwashiorkor caused by the oppression of the colonial regimes as those that after independence. Moreover, the leaders of the independence movement were more interested in independence from the colonial regime than in political freedom of their citizens. Indeed, from the west coast of Africa in Ghana, to the East African coast, the common slogan of the independence movement campaigners was self-government now, which is clearly different from political freedom now. These distinctions are important, and I think they point to the source of our problems. We, at the time of independence, did not have or did not regard political philosophy as important as we should have thought at that time. So while the UNC conservatively emphasized nationalism, UPU, apparently because of both admired Kwame Nkrumah, embraced the people, a code word for socialism. Socialism could not be explicitly vehemently advocated before independence because under the colonial regime, it was a political crime to believe in or advocate communism, a political term that broadly covered socialism as well. In South Africa, for example, the Suppression of Communism Act, later renamed the Internal Security Act in the 1970s after the Soweto riots, was enacted in 1950 to deal with Mandela's growing movement and his fiery political rhetoric. Under the Act, the Suppression of Communism Act, people could be banned or forbidden to make any speech in public or their movements restricted to specifically legally defined areas. What was going on in South Africa was not very different from what was going on in colonial Africa in the 50s. The provisions of the Act banning people or restricting them to specific areas were repealed after Mandela was released in 1990. In any case, they would have been rendered void by the new constitution enacted in 1996 if they had not been repealed. And so the formation of UPC, apparently due to Robert's influence, moved the UPC closer to the left and of center than the right of center after the amalgamation of UNC and UPU. It can therefore be argued that at the time of independence, one of the two main parties, UPC, was of a socialist inclination, and the other, DP, was of a capitalist inclination. Suppression of political freedom under independence prevented the political parties from evolving their political philosophies into a mature ideology. Only the party in government, that is UPC, had the freedom to explicitly articulate a political philosophy which we described above in the common man's, articulated in the common man's charter. Now, let me look at the new political parties. Are they different from the old parties or not? After a long spell of dictatorship under the military rule, either the old political parties were revived or new political parties started to emerge after Idi Amin was overthrown in 1979. UPM fell in the latter category. It was formed in 1980 by Museveni and his colleagues for purposes of contesting the elections of that year, 1980. All the leaders of UPM, should be noted, except Sam and Gertrude in Juba, were former members of UPC. One may assume that for practical reasons, UPM was some form of a reincarnation or a breakaway branch of UPC. For some mysterious reasons, however, UPM suddenly sank into political oblivion after the election of the Constituent Assembly in 1993. Political parties were allowed to send 2 delegates to the CA but UPM and UPC declined to exercise that option. Therefore, thereafter, the UPM became moribund. Instead, NRM emerged as the logical political successor to UPM, or rather, NRM politically replaced the political vacuum left by the quiet demise of UPM. The leadership of NRM, like that of UPM, consisted of the same former UPC members. In the late 1990s, internal squabbles within NRM erupted and resulted in the formation of the Reform Agenda faction of NRM, which ultimately crystallized into FDC, led by Colonel Kizza Besigye. Kizza Besigye was a founding member of NRM and probably also originally a member of UPC earlier on, judging by his political company and association. What emerges from this brief history is the uncontested view that FDC, NRM, UPM, and UPC belong to a specific political genealogy, and therefore they share political kinship, which leads one to conclude that they embraced a common political philosophy because the same individuals were members of the same political parties at one time or another in the past. When these same individuals formed a new political party, they did not renounce the original political philosophy of the mother party, which they inherited from the mother party they belonged to earlier. Since UPM does not exist anymore, the main question should be whether UPC, NRM, and FDC share political philosophy inherited from UPC. If they do, what philosophy is it? Those who talk about unity should be interested in the answer to the question posed above. The current leaders of UPC have neither explicitly revived the old socialist philosophy of UPC nor renounced it. The best we can do right now in order to decipher UPC's political philosophy is to examine its vision and mission as currently articulated by UPC leaders. UPC's vision is to build an independent, united, democratic, just, peaceful, and prosperous nation where all its citizens are equal, have equal opportunities and equitable access to national resources. The mission of UPC is stated as, quote, a social democratic party that seeks to safeguard national independence and promote national unity, equality, equity, and human rights. This is what remains of the original UPC political philosophy. Then we can conclude that it has both shrunk and narrowed it down. As a result, the basic components of UPC political philosophy today do not seem to remain those articulated in 1967 and 1970. The new components have their purpose to safeguard the independence of Uganda, promote national unity, and guarantee equitable access to national resources. We can therefore assume that the earlier 5 components have been abandoned and replaced by some vague general objectives of the party. What seems to be conspicuously missing is an explicit commitment to protect individual liberty. It is not sufficient to say that the party will protect human rights. All political parties, including NRM, say that. Again, we should not emphasize the difference between safeguarding independence of the nation and protecting political freedom of the individual, because the two are not exactly the same. Independence does not necessarily guarantee political freedom. Equal or equitable access to national resources, we assume, is the essence of socialist political philosophy, but it is not made explicit. We can therefore assume that the original 5 components of UPC political philosophy discussed above remain intact, except where they have been explicitly disavowed. The burden should remain on the leaders of UPC to demonstrate otherwise. The only question is, to what extent has the same philosophy been inherited by UPC descendants? Is UPC political philosophy still traceable in NRM and FDC? Ever since Museveni created the so-called broad-based government, NRM has thrived on philosophical ambiguity. The result is that NRM is a party that has stupidly taken pride in defying ideological identity, and that is failing to articulate a specific political philosophy. This aspect of NRM is probably the main source of its political weakness. As long as the electoral process is not driven by issues, a political party can thrive, or even do well without articulating a political philosophy. That situation will be short-lived as long as the electoral process is not driven by issues. As soon as these social changes take place, a political party without an ideology or political philosophy is the one that poses the least threat to its rivals, as soon as political freedom is guaranteed, as well as we shall see below. So the issue of political philosophy is important to democratization. You cannot democratize a political system without political parties, and you cannot have healthy political parties without political philosophies. Now, I look at Democratic Party. The other major political party which clearly stands apart from all the others we have discussed is the Democratic Party, which is also the oldest political party in Uganda. It was formed in 1954 as the independence movement gathered momentum in the country. From its formation, DP articulated a clear political philosophy. According to the preamble of the DP Constitution, the members of DP are individually to be guided, quote, guided by the principle of truth and justice, unquote. The preamble explicitly proclaims that, quote, the people have the inalienable right to freely choose their government by the democratic process, unquote, and to champion, respect, and promote the fundamental human rights and freedoms embodied in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The DP is the only party that specifically refers to human rights as articulated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as well as the observe and uphold the rule of law. No party constitution in Uganda has ever been more explicit on the importance of protecting human rights and political freedom. Among the aims of and objectives of DP under Article 3 of the Constitution are to ensure the general welfare and liberty of the people of Uganda, promote and preserve unity of Uganda, at all times to champion and preserve democracy in Uganda, fight for, protect and preserve the fundamental human rights, preserve the traditions, customs and institutions of Uganda, and support all peoples struggling for self-determination and freedom from oppression. Of course, that was a reference to Southern Africa, but this was in the original constitution of DP. It is clear that from its inception, DP had a clear political philosophy on the centrality of human rights in the political philosophy. However, it is one thing for a political party to have a political philosophy and another to put it in practice. As the English saying goes, practice makes perfect. I have not heard the leadership of DP articulate the philosophy of the party clearly written in its constitution. The identity of DP would stand out from the other political parties if the leaders of DP bothered to use it as a solid ground for justification to govern Uganda on democratic basis, as spelled out in the DP constitution. Due to political repression, we have described above, DP, like all the other political parties in Uganda, suffered from the political repression by Obote, by Amin, and Museveni. Judging by the internal squabbles within DP during the electoral season of 2011, personality rather than political philosophy has dominated and animated political acrimony within DP. DP, however, seems more internally coherent philosophically than the other parties, even though DP lost a substantial number of its leaders to UPC, to FDC, and to NRM. Historically, DP has lost more leaders to the other political parties than any other. This could be proof of the original strength of DP. Note that we put emphasis on leaders. DP has lost leaders who defected rather than members, the ordinary members of DP who joined the other political parties. In 1964, Bezo Bataringaya led the 5 DP MPs to cross to the aisle in a carefully orchestrated move over from DP opposition to UPC government benches. Obviously, those MPs did not cross from DP to UPC for philosophical reasons. Political corruption is a better explanation for the crossover from BP to UPC in 1964. Moreover, Benzo Batalingaya was immediately rewarded with a coveted cabinet post of Minister of Internal Affairs. More recently, DP leaders have changed their allegiance and defected to NRM and FDC after 2005. Among the most prominent defectors from DP, the most prominent Dr. Gilbert Bukenya, former Vice President Dr. Specioza Kazibwe, former Vice President Professor Semakula Kiwanuka, Ambassador to the Middle East, and Edward Sekandi, also a former Vice President. So you can see that leaders have abandoned the DP and walked over to other political parties. The question is, did they do this for philosophical reasons? And the answer unequivocally, in my opinion, is no. So here the question is, how do the former members of DP who defected to FDC philosophically fit into FDC, which apparently inherited its political philosophy from UPC or NRM? NRM and FDC have not clearly distinguished themselves from UPC. The burden lies on them until they do so. Answering the question posed above gives us a glimpse into the so-called politics of the belly, which has dominated Africa for a few decades. Philosophy seems secondary to our politics in Uganda. Personality and political status take priority in the strategic thinking of Ugandan politicians. Those who changed political allegiance between political parties did not do so due to philosophical reasons. They were looking for political and or material rewards and not advancing a political cause for solving society's problems as a whole. Political defectors in Uganda are the direct consequence of corruption in Uganda. Now you can see the connection between corruption I've been describing and political behavior. In fact, political manipulation of the political parties is restricted to the top leaders, reflecting political corruption. Everyone knows that the masses follow the leaders close to them, no matter which political party or philosophy they espouse or political party the leaders belong to. This is because their decisions are not driven by issues. The weakness of the current system resides in the fact that it is readily manipulated and therefore easily corruptible, especially during the electoral season. It is much easier to corrupt voters not interested in issues but passionate about personalities. Within the political parties themselves, the absence of political philosophy is clearly visible. Take, for example, the litigation of the various factions within DP. One faction accused the other of violating the party constitution by holding a delegates conference at a particular time and in a specific place, and therefore acting without authority to do so. Litigation that followed which was aimed at delegitimizing the results of the party electoral process, seemed to be no more than a clash of personalities. There are no philosophical disputes involved in these disputes. In fact, political party leaders who fail to secure the nomination for the presidential candidacy often settle to run as independent candidates outside the party structure, or in the case of Sebagala, they join another political party, NRM, exposing their philosophical bankruptcy for anyone to see. Such behavior is a clear indication that political behavior in Uganda is not within the and between political parties motivated by political philosophy. It is driven by corruption, and that's very important. Anybody dreaming about a smooth democratization of Uganda must be wary of these facts. What this means is that the leaders of the political parties have not yet internalized the democratic norms which govern the political process and the rule of law within the political party process. No one wants to accept defeat, even in a certified free and fair election of the political party. We can only blame this political theater on the political suppression of the parties during the last 40 decades. There has not been enough learning period in using the democratic electoral process in Uganda. In 40 years, there have been about 3 or 4 elections within the political parties. This very little learning, therefore, or experience has taken place. There will be no political maturity until the leaders of the political parties begin to understand that they are in politics in order to participate fairly and in the process advance the collective political cause, and not primarily to advance personal interests and ambitions or associate voracious personal greed. The situation in Uganda can be sharply contrasted with that in South Africa. In South Africa, in spite of the fact that ANC was banned within South Africa after the Sharpeville massacre in 1960, ANC continued to operate underground and in exile and advanced its cause of political freedom. Members of ANC operated within the political structure of the ANC party. In Uganda, the political parties were politically frozen and prohibited to engage in any political activity. Political development in Uganda was literally halted. The consequences of political repression are clearly reflected in the immature political behavior of the leaders of the political parties in Uganda. So we have a big hurdle to overcome in democratization of Uganda. It's not going to be as smooth as some of you are made to believe. Lastly, we look at NRMO. The NRM represents the transformation of NRM from being an organization in which all political parties technically belonged to and formed the so-called broad-based government before 2005 to a registered political party like all the others after the Constitution was amended to allow multi-parties to operate independently. NRM mutated into NRMO. This is not interesting transformation we shall comment on later. The history of political evolution of NRMO is in some respects similar to and in others different from the UPC. We examined earlier some important aspects of the ideology or political philosophy of UPC and how it was rationally how it was rationally related to but incompatible with the process of democratization of Uganda. We shall do a similar study of NRM for purposes of comparison. The similarities relate to the fact that all leaders of NRM were originally members of UPC. That's important. Historical fact. It's a very important historical fact. This gives us an interesting historical paradox. When the leaders of NRM formed the organization, they tried their best to contrast it with with UPC, and in fact denigrated UPC as a sectarian party. This charge is, however, according to available evidence, not valid. The charge was motivated by politics and the desire to acquire political power. Museveni knew that as long as Obote lived, he could not become a leader of UPC. The truth is that there was a lot of personal animosity between Obote and Museveni. So the difference between UPC and NRM is therefore not philosophical. It is mutual hatred between the two men who led the two political parties that compelled Museveni to form UPM. These facts are important. The interesting question, however, is the leaders of NRM believe in all the five or some of the components of the philosophy of UPC we discussed earlier. At the time they were members of UPC. This question is important because it goes to the core of the issue we are trying to resolve, namely the utility of political philosophy in the process of democratizing a political system. Believing in a specific political philosophy produces a conviction in the believer. For those who are honest, beliefs do not disappear suddenly or at the whim of a new idea. Politics or the political ideological slogan they encounter, randomly. I can here offer personal testimony to some of the issues and the questions we are dealing with. After the charter, Common Man Charter was launched by Obote in 1969, I was at Makerere University, and I can testify to the fact that Yoweri Museveni, Ruhakana Rugunda, and the Eria Kategaya not only supported the abolition of the monarchies, they believed in the Republican principle. They also enthusiastically embraced the introduction of the fundamental principle of socialism as a progressive ideology suitable for solving problems Uganda was facing at the time. In the many debates that took place in the main hall at Makerere College, as it was then called, between the proponents of the charter, the Common Man Charter, that is Museveni, Rugunda, and Kategaya, and the proponents of the move to the left as a whole, those who opposed, the opponents of the move to the left, who included Sulaiman Chigundu and Mate Mukasa, and of course myself, the proponents, they seemed at the time to be genuinely committed. These guys, Museveni, Rugunda, and Kategaya, they seem to be genuinely committed to UPC, political philosophy. So it is amazing that Museveni comes out and starts talking about sectarian theory, which was just a justification because he could not become a leader of UPC, so he had to find a reason to create his own party. In fact, some of them, the proponents, were members of Ken Adoko's General Service Unit. Museveni also, although he was at the time a student at Dar es Salaam, very actively participated in the annual debates of the three sister colleges, Dar es Salaam, Nairobi, and Makerere, and I was there and I saw him. That was my first encounter with Museveni. He behaved as a committed and radical socialist, even though he has alleged in his biography that he was a member of DP until 1971, a claim that seems to be clouded in doubt. I do not remember any DP member at the time. Many of them were under detention in Ruzira anyway, publicly advocating support for the move to the left, as advocated by Obote, as Museveni did. So what does this history tell us? It tells us a lot about the character of Museveni. As we have already pointed out, we can treat NRMO as a legitimate descendant of UPC because all the leaders of NRMO were members, former members of UPC, who were committed to UPC political philosophy in the late 1960s. The important question is whether we can trace any elements of UPC political philosophy in NRMO. If not, then why? Answering these questions can help us solve the puzzle why Museveni has tried to keep a long distance between him and UPC, behavior that does not make philosophical sense, but is rooted in personal politics, struggle for power. It is clear that Museveni could not become the leader of UPC as long as Obote was alive. NRM political philosophy may therefore be traced from two sources other than UPC. These are Museveni's theory of sectarianism and his political expedience, of which the theory of sectarianism was the best exemplification and explanation, providing the reason for or rationale to repudiate UPC political philosophy. Museveni has always been a cunning political calculator. In fact, adherence to moral principles and ethical standards are not Museveni's greatest virtues. What was the political motivation for sectarian theory? First, in 1986, Museveni argued that it was premature to allow political parties in Uganda to exist, and therefore dangerous in the political process of the country like Uganda, because existing political parties were built on sectarianism rather than on political philosophy or class structure. A comprehensive discussion of this sectarian theory, you can find it in the Sowing the Mustard Seed, but also even more important, in Museveni's manifesto, election manifesto 2006 to 2006 elections. First, UPC and DP were cited as typical examples of sectarianism by Museveni. More explicitly, Museveni was arguing that the existence of political parties was detrimental to Uganda, although he had been an enthusiastic member of UPC and in fact served in the Akena Doko's General Service. Museveni's explanation, though convincing to the theoretically illiterate and historically uninformed, was as artificial as it was erroneous theoretically. It was pure malicious politics. The argument was that political parties must be suppressed until the sociological conditions for their existence were or become ripe. This argument was a contorted political premise which had no scientific basis, both in theory and in history of the contemporary world. It was cleverly designed to serve Museveni's selfish political ambitions. Surprisingly, people in the West took it seriously. They never questioned its validity in view of its conflict with the protection of inalienable human rights and international law. Africans were apparently equated to political imbeciles waiting to be liberated by class formation. It was ironic that of all people, Museveni, an anti-imperialist, was the advocate of such a theory. According to Museveni's sectarian theory, ripeness for the existence of political parties was supposed to be determined by the existence of a middle class, which alone, according to Museveni's erroneous theory, was regarded as the sole source of political philosophy for political party. Political philosophy can exist without the middle class. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle are some of the most famous political philosophers history has ever produced. Their philosophies, which are still taught at university level today, were formulated over 2,000 years ago in societies which had no middle class. Note that there was no middle class in Greece when these philosophies were written. The existence or causation of a middle class is a very recent, the recent social transformation, which even Museveni himself, in his invalid theory, attributes to the recent history of the Industrial Revolution in the 18th and the 19th centuries. The assumption and the full implication of Museveni's theory of sectarianism directly linked to class structure or its absence thereof as both contradictory and, of course, erroneous. Human state instincts and the political beliefs of people are not determined by their social class. In US and UK, for example, there are poor people who belong to the working class but believe in the ideology of the conservative or Republican parties. Conversely, there are rich millionaires in the Democratic part of US and the Labour Party of US who uphold the virtues of liberalism. If Museveni's theory of sectarianism was valid, this would never have happened. Political philosophy would run along class lines, but it does not. That fact alone is sufficient to discredit Museveni's sectarian theory. The link between sectarianism and class structure is therefore invalid. Moreover, there is sectarianism in societies with the middle classes, such as the British in Northern Ireland, or Israel, and India. Even though, in fact, in India, and Israel too, some political parties are based on religion. The Hindu party, and in Israel there is the Shah party, and so it is a lie concocted by Museveni that such the existence of sectarian political parties is offensive. In fact, it is part of human rights. If people want to form a party like that, they should be allowed to do so, and they are allowed in India and in Northern Ireland and in Israel. So it's part of protection of human rights. So Museveni's political philosophy is actually not a philosophy at all. Even more important, how would one explain racism which cuts across class structures? Racism and sectarianism are founded on the same premises of discrimination between people based on their biological differences. Museveni's argument was, however, cunningly designed to lay the theoretical foundation for the suppression of political freedom under NRM. Clearly, that meant that Museveni did not believe in the political freedom from a philosophical point of view. The fact is, this fact is traceable throughout Museveni's political career. To that extent, Museveni was free not to articulate a rational political philosophy, either socialist or capitalist, as a basis for his policies. Excuse me. Museveni's main objective was to suppress the old political parties, because his memory of the 1980 elections, in which he himself lost, and his party UPM won only one parliamentary seat, was still fresh in his mind. The defeat of UPM in 1980 can hardly be attributed to Obote's rigging of the elections. Not entirely. Museveni had to find a way to suppress the control and control the other political parties, which could ruin his political career. But we are fully aware that at Dar es Salaam, Museveni was a radical socialist whose undergraduate thesis examined Fanon's theory of violence in the context of colonial liberation or the quest for independence. The thesis did not in any way link class structure to political behavior. In Mozambique, like in Uganda, where Museveni applied Fanon's theory, there was no middle class structure. Mozambique was in the 60s and it still is in the 2000s a peasant society with a social structure far less developed than that of Uganda. However, in Mozambique, there were political parties such as Frelimo, the Front for the Liberation of Mozambique. You can see Museveni is not all that creative either. The Front for NASA and was the Front for Liberation of whatever, National Salvation, which effectively participated in the liberation struggle against colonialism. They were not plagued by sectarianism. The contradiction inherent in Museveni's argument was that African political parties were good when they were fighting colonialism or apartheid, in South Africa, for example, and Frelimo in Mozambique, but dangerous and sectarian after colonialism and apartheid and military dictatorships are defeated, as Museveni had done in Uganda in 1986. Nothing made any sense in Museveni's sectarian theory. It was meant to dupe people, not to throw light on the murky political problems labeled sectarianism. The theory was invalid because it was based on erroneous sociological premises or assumptions. Protection of human rights and political freedom, the rights to associate, to assemble, and to express oneself, in particular as stipulated under the international law, such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, does not depend and is not premised on the existence of specific social class structures. It depends on the recognition of the individual human worth and dignity, on which the protection of inherent or inalienable human rights depends. existence of class structures does not determine the protection of unalienable human rights. Moreover, when Museveni amended the Constitution of Uganda in 2005 in order to allow multi-parties, the class structure of the political party of Uganda was exactly the same as it was in 86. Excuse me. As it was in 20 years earlier, when Museveni argued that political parties would be sectarian and therefore premature because of the absence of the middle class. Lacking a rational philosophical foundation, Museveni's politics was opaque, it was dangerous, and by nature necessarily oppressive. Now, how can we democratize Uganda with a man who thinks like that, who reasons like that, or a political party that is constituted on those premises? Museveni's theory of sectarianism made him philosophically and inevitably the arch enemy of both political freedom and political philosophy in Uganda. He deliberately chose to sabotage both. He was the enemy of political freedom because he pretended to be philosophically blind to the sociological reality of human rights and their protection. These contradictions produced NRMO, and of course NRM area. NRM was falsely declared the foundation of broad-based government, when in fact it was the ultimate instrument of political oppression. Museveni could not then and now cannot articulate a coherent political philosophy on which NRMO stands. We challenge him to do so if he is not an opportunist, a charge he loves to indiscriminately throw at his political opponents. NRMO has no political philosophy. Under the NRM constitution, the NRM is a multi-ideological political party. That is in Article 6 of the party, I understand. It seems to be a new species of political parties. The question is how a political party can have political philosophy and at the same time be multi-ideological. That sounds like a contradiction, but it clearly reflects the political expedience with which has characterized Museveni's political career and nefarious political calculations. I want to emphasize this point because it is important. To NRM or to be a multi-ideological political organization, what does that mean? And why do rational, apparently educated people believe in such a hollow, the premise which cannot be validated by history or empirically by contemporary organizations? So I'm trying to point this out because it is important. If people sit in NRM and believe that they really belong there, what philosophy do they give us, that makes them believe that a political organization can be a multi-ideological political organization. This is a deception. Clearly, it is a political deception. So we should be careful when we are talking about the democratization. Philosophy is important, but philosophy is the only foundation that gives you a rational political action. But when a political philosophy is irrational, like NRMs, you cannot get any good results out of it. As one medical doctor was testifying to in OJ's trial in California, put in garbage, you get out of garbage. And that's what I see with the NRMO, the calling itself. Why do these educated people believe that NRM is actually a rationally based, philosophically based political party? Given all these, what we know about it, that partly explains why anybody can supposedly be a member of NRMO, regardless of his political philosophy. Under Article 6 of NRM Constitution, the NRM is described as a national, broad-based, inclusive, democratic, God forbid, non-sectarian, multi-ideological, multi-interest, and progressive mass organization. That is sufficient. I was quoting Article 6 of NRM. It makes no sense. It is clear. It is a deception. And we believe in this. And so be warned. If you belong to NRM, we want you to tell us the rational basis, philosophical basis that keeps you in and justifies you to belong to NRM. Moreover, a mere description of a political party in its constitution, as we saw in the case of UPC, does not necessarily create the political reality the political party aspires to in its constitution. Before Article 6 of NRMO constitution can be taken seriously, NRMO must, through its practice, demonstrate that in fact it fits the description given of it in Article 6. For example, under Article 7, the aims of and objectives of NRMO include consolidation of democracy and constitutional governance and consolidation of national unity. That can't happen with such a contradictory organization with an irrational political philosophy. As I told you, history has already taught us that all political parties with the irrational political philosophies, like the Communist Party in USSR and the National Party in South Africa, are destined to extinction simply because they are not compatible with the political reality, and they cannot preserve peace, protect human rights in their contradictory philosophies. NRM or behavior has been the opposite of what its constitution says or aspires to be. NRMO has, for example, has consistently violated the right of the people to assemble and associate by brutally suppressing these rights protected by the Constitution and international law. Moreover, constitutional governance cannot be achieved with corruption increasing and beyond the control of the regime in power. The situation has gotten worse. Corruption has now mutated into organized crime, as we have already indicated in earlier conversations. Neither has NRM or promoted national unity as it often proclaims. National unity cannot be achieved in an atmosphere where sectarianism and discrimination are rampant and legitimized by the preferential treatment accorded to certain ethnic groups by NRMO in business, going back to privatization and state enterprises of the 90s, and promotions in the armed forces, that is, in the police, army, and intelligence agencies, calculated to enable certain groups to be dominant. Nationwide, people are complaining about Banyankole Banyarwanda domination, whether this is justified or not. NRM leadership has done nothing to diffuse these issues. I'll stop here for a few minutes and I'll come back and conclude this conversation. Thank you.
Fellow citizens, we call upon you to practice resistance and protest against Museveni. We call upon you to oppose strongly the Museveni government, which is responsible for the downfall of Uganda. It is important to know that Museveni is afraid of the millions of people who are living for that day, for the light of day when Uganda will be liberated from his dictatorial regime. Fellow citizens, it's been 24 years of dictatorship. We should all know that at present our drive for freedom has already grown so strong that Museveni has already begun to change his tactics. We call upon people to participate, to organize silent stand-ins for a free Uganda. We call upon people to demonstrate that we're tired of him. We call upon governments in the United States of America and abroad, people in responsible positions, politicians, only to act in the service of peace, justice, and freedom for Uganda. We call upon people to use all legal and imaginative means and methods in order to ensure peace, justice, and freedom for Uganda. We call upon people from the north and south, from the east and west, and yes, from the central province of Uganda to be loyal to one another. We must preserve our loyalty to human dignity. We call upon people once again not to wait until it is too late to begin thinking about a free Uganda. We call for a new attitude. Arise, fellow citizens, arise. Let us fight for a free Uganda. Museveni must go.
You are listening to Voice of Uganda Radio, the mouthpiece of all Ugandans, wherever they may be, to voice their problems without fear of any retribution. The Voice of Uganda Radio works in sync with FADU, the Federalist Alliance of Democracy and Development in Uganda. FADU is an organization that was formed to work as a platform for all Ugandans at home and outside, to work synergistically to liberate our mother Uganda from the ruthless invaders that have sucked it dry. Therefore, FADU invites all able Ugandans to act now and save the Ugandan humanity that is being slaughtered, destroyed, and robbed by a few people unworthy to call themselves Ugandans. Many people are crying for action in Uganda as they languish in misery. FADU echoes their cries by by making the loudest alarm to everyone to join FADU, not tomorrow or the next day, but today. The number to join is 408-904-7038. The email is info@fadu.org.
So listeners, welcome back to Democratization of Africa, the case of Uganda in comparative perspective. I've been talking about political philosophy and trying to emphasize the point that you cannot democratize a political system without political philosophy. Historically, we've studied the British system, the American system, and all democratic systems in Europe. They all are founded on political philosophy. And the point I was trying to emphasize is that when a political philosophy, a political party is founded on an irrational political philosophy, it inevitably dies sooner than later. And that's the best example I'm trying to give is NRMO. NRM, the only problem I have is how rational people can really genuinely say that they can belong to a political party whose philosophical premises are contradictory and irrational. However, the more serious problem for the party, the NRM, is the internal struggle within NRMO. There are widespread discontent within NRMO. Some members of NRMO are threatening to form a backbench cabinet. We are threatening some time back. Others are being expelled from the party. And these are symptoms, and they are very important symptoms of the type of political party NRMO is. They are alleging that the leadership of NRMO is not pro-people and has failed to carry out the necessary social and economic reforms. The group's objective, according to, for example, Mohammed Nsereko, is, quote, a new political dispensation. We wanted to replace the current leadership. We want to differ on term limits. We want to differ on its bad governance, economic mismanagement of the country, and we stand for how low taxes, increased wages, and more investment. We have differed fundamentally, and term is now to cause change for the good of the common man. Now, this is this is from within NRM, and this was reported by Sunday Monitor, July 8, 2012. So the NRM, they can pretend, but they are not as coherent as they ought to be. In fact, Mr. Barnabas Tinkatsimire summed up NRMO problems when he said that, quote, the movement we joined is not the same movement we are having now. We are giving the president up to 2006, and if he says he is coming back, we shall defeat him. through the power of the vote. That's Tinkasimile Barnabas. I'm quoting him. So not everything is not okay within NRM. The only question I'm always I don't have an answer to. Probably I can speculate and guess. Is how can people, rational people, be members of NRM, an organization which says that they are multi-ideological. Multi-ideological in this sense, I assume, means like having many religions with different faiths, different scriptures, but all of them to put together, telling you that they can lead you to heaven. That's impossible. The Hindu scriptures says life is recycled. The Christians, they say the Jesus is the savior of everybody. The Jews say that the Messiah has never come, but we are waiting for him. The Muslims, they say the Nabi Muhammad was the prophet. Now, I want you to tell me how you can combine all these religions into one single religion that gives you an everlasting life in heaven. It's impossible. That's what NRM is all about. So by calling itself a multi-ideological organization. Another observer of NRM or politics, Justice George Kanyehamba, has commented that, quote, it is beginning to dawn upon many Ugandans that today the most damaging opponents of NRM party's leadership are the intelligent, thoughtful, and dedicated sons and daughters of Uganda who happen to be former bosom friends and comrades of President Museveni and his cadres in the ruling oligarchy of the current government of Uganda. Most of those fleeing from NRM party are highly educated, literate, with a capacity and desire to write scholarly articles and books and deliver absolving oratories to enlighten Ugandans about what is going on in their country. This is George W. Kanyehamba, who was a strong NRM leader. So, two things seem to stand out at this time. NRM is not internally coherent because it has no rational political philosophy. The idea of a multi-ideological political party is a non-starter. This condition is not necessarily a source of political virtue, as Museveni may have wanted us to believe. The lack of philosophical identity or clarity makes NRM the biggest political prostitute in Uganda and on the African continent. As it turns out, NRM is built on and is a source of political corruption, which is the engine that propels NRM. Anybody can cross over from DP, from UPC, and from FDC and pretend to comfortably fit into NRM as long as he corruptly benefits from doing so. How can a political party with specific social interests to protect in society be philosophically multi-ideological. A political party that labels itself multi-ideological must be a political fraud. It projects the false image that a political party consisting of committed communists and capitalists can formulate a rational political policy to guide its membership to achieve noble goals as the protection of human rights. Communism is dying because it is incompatible with the political freedom. But Museveni is telling us that political communism can be a part of NRMO. No no wonder this regime has no problem in suppressing political freedom and violating human rights. Doesn't it make sense? If you don't believe in freedom, you can of course pretend that you do, but your behavior will betray you, and that has already happened with the NRM. This explains why NRM constitution is ambiguously drafted in order to avoid the commitment to any specific political philosophy or goal. For example, Article 1 of the NRM constitution provides that NRM is politically committed to promoting and upholding democracy and the good governance first of the as the core value, but also as the sine qua non for national transformation. The concept of democracy is not defined, nor is good governance. Two elements that are sadly lacking in the NRMO. We must remember that not long ago there were many dictatorial regimes which pronounced their countries as the Democratic Republic of. Such deceptive labels did not convert a political reality of dictatorship into a democracy. Similarly, there are many democratic countries which do not label themselves as democratic republics. Truth resides in facts, not in wishes or deceptive labels. Article 4, excuse me, Article 4 of NRM Constitution provides that vision is, it provides for the vision of NRM is a peaceful, united, democratic, harmonious, industrialized, transformed, and prosperous Uganda within a strong and united Africa. What a mess with the war going on in Congo. The mission of NRM and Article 5 is to transform Uganda from a poor peasant society into a modern, industrial, united and prosperous society. Of course, that can't happen with the poverty increasing. In pursuing its aims and objectives under Article 6.2, NRM is supposed to be guided by the principles such as pursuit of peace, democracy, and good governance, national unity, national non-sectarianism, affirmative action, equal opportunities, socio-economic transformation, and so on and so on. These are just window dressing. They are not describing the reality that on the ground with NRMO. The question is whether enumerating these principles, the principles and the mission and the vision of NRMO makes any difference in the real politics of NRMO. Without a clear political philosophy, the rest seems useless. For example, Article 7 talks about eradicating corruption in Uganda. Can you believe that? NRMO promotes corruption and is part of corruption. These people crossing over from other parties to NRM are evidence of corruption. So, how can NRM fight and eradicate corruption? Part 3, in this conversation, we are dealing with corruption scandal. We've dealt with corruption scandals under NRM during the last 20 years. It leaves no doubt that under NRM regime there is no transparency, there is no accountability, there is no integrity within the regime. Talking about eradicating corruption under NRMO is a big joke, to say the least. So, the Article 7 of NRM Constitution talks about consolidating democracy and the constitutional governance. Peace, security, police and armed soldiers have to be, to prevent them from shooting children and pregnant women. They've been shooting innocent people, and you tell us they are for rule of law. That is impossible. So the NRM story is a long one. I can go on for a long time, but I think that is enough to tell you that NRM as an organization has no rational political philosophy. It is contradictory. The quality of the prognosis in any human endeavor depends on the validity of the premises of the theory on which it is based. In formulating this prognosis of democratization of Uganda based on the existing knowledge of the process of democratization, we proceed on the assumption that at the present time, social science has not yet formulated a concise, valid theory of democratization process. There is a lot to be learned about democratization and how best it can be achieved. The best formulation of the democratization process comes from Samuel P. Huntington. As it will become clear from our critique of Huntington's formulation, even though it is very useful and it is the best formulation so far, it does not yet amount to full-fledged valid theory of democratization that can predict specific outcomes of democratization process. We shall try to raise a few issues with the Huntington's formulation that illustrate its shortcomings. These issues include the predictability of democratization, the concept of the wave, the absence of the idea of social change, which transforms society and its values, and the total absence of the idea of a fundamental concept of human rights, which, in fact, throughout history, has activated and propelled the whole process of democratization, from the Magna Carta in 1215 to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. One of the most useful functions of a valid theory is to predict future events, not necessarily precisely or accurately, but in order for the social sciences, at least approximately accurate predictions. From this perspective, Huntington's formulation of the process of democratization is elementary at best. For example, he gives us no clue as to when and under what conditions a specific authoritarian regime such as NRM would collapse and or give way to the process of democratization through a revolutionary transformation from normal progressive reforms leading to a democratic political system. In fact, Huntington himself admits that it would be folly to attempt to predict in which countries democracy will consolidate and in which countries it will not. And no attempt will be made here to make that prediction. That's Huntington quoting his book, The Third Wave, Democratization in the Late 20th Century. So even Huntington cannot predict, cannot tell us how a regime like NRM can be democratized. This honest admission by Huntington as to the limits of the theory of democratization clearly means that Huntington's formulation of democratization does not amount to a concise, valid scientific theory. It is a tentative formulation of the democratization process, giving general guidelines to democratization. I got a signal that I lose power. So thank you. I'll be back in a few minutes.
Kumira malusu nange nakoyo kutunulira ababalina ababwe ne basolobeza nga nze bensalirwa nasomosa omukka gw'abalemwa nengobera ku lukalu lwabo abawanguzi kati nange bwentula mu bantu mpulira njamu byonna byonna bye babadde bansuubiza ensi neggulu olwo nendo bambifunidde mu kino ekitereke ky'omukwano oli wange ebe bananvuma oli wange ebe banakuba emikono ebangobera wabwe genda nawe oli wange ebe bananvuma oli wange ebe banakuba emikono ebangobera wabwe genda nawe kati mukwano notula ogume okakane nze manyi nibawo kino na misana endowooza n'omutima gwange siri bikyusa buli wonjagalira mukwano bibeerawo wooli ebikuluma ng'ombuulira nange nkubuulira ebyange akaseka kalungi ku masako tokamalangako boboleyo
democratization of Africa. The case of Uganda in a comparative perspective. I've decided to spend some time talking about political philosophy and theory because without knowledge we cannot achieve anything. We cannot predict the future and we cannot be accurate in our predictions. Huntington's formulation which I'm using here, did not and could not be used to predict, for example, the Arab Spring, under which change in the regimes in Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya came from below, not from above. This is not surprising because Huntington's formulation of democratization is supposed to be predominantly engineered from the top, where either a coup d'etat leads to liberation or liberalization, or the regime in power and the opposition carry out the reforms that are mutually beneficial to the contesting reformers, but nevertheless eventually lead to democratization of the system as a whole. This causes the changes, or the causes of the changes in the Arab Spring were rooted in the human desire by the ordinary people for political freedom and justice. Museveni should remember that. Museveni should be aware of that. But greed probably cannot allow him to appreciate those facts. It was not, that is the Arab Spring, was not engineered by reformers in parliament who, like NRM regime, were the obstacles to democratization. The reactions of ordinary people to the regimes in Tunisia, Libya, and Egypt, and now Syria, of course, were, however, the direct result of social change within the political system. The people had come to realize that the regime in Tunisia, in Egypt, and in Libya, and now Syria, were oppressive, just like NRM. So the people put their destiny in their own hands. And this has happened before in history, it will happen again, and it is happening in Uganda. So those who support the regime in NRM regime in Uganda, take note that sooner or later the regime will disappear because of the forces of democratization. In the absence of a clear formula, however, to predict a future potential regime subject to democratization, we cannot apply Huntington's formulation to the NRM regime in Uganda. Huntington's formulation cannot help us to formulate a predictable prognosis for democratization in Uganda. This leads us to the second defect in Huntington's formulation. The second issue is conceptual. It has to do with the nature of the concept of democratization as a wave. Huntington describes democratization in terms of waves. Like Huntington writes, quote, "In 1750, no democratic institutions at the national level existed in the Western world. In 1900, such institutions existed in many countries. By the late 20th century, many more countries possessed democratic institutions. These institutions emerged in waves of democratization. A wave of democratization is a group of transitions from non-democratic to democratic regimes that occur within a specified period of time and that significantly outnumber transitions in the opposite direction during that period of time. A wave also usually involves liberalization or partial democratization in political systems that do not become fully democratic. 3 waves of democratization have occurred in the modern world. Huntington writes, Huntington links the first wave of democratization to Protestantism. He writes, historically Protestantism and democracy were linked with each other. The first democratic impulse in the Western world came with the Puritan revolution in the 17th century. The overwhelming majority of the countries that became democratic in the first wave of democratization in the 19th century were Protestant. The second wave countries after World War II were religiously diverse. The third wave of the 1970s and 80s was overwhelmingly a Catholic wave. By 1990, many of the original causes of the third wave had been significantly weakened or exhausted. Unquote. That's Huntington. Nevertheless, Huntington concludes that the third wave of democratization was propelled forward by extraordinary global growth of the 1950s and 60s. The era of growth came to an end with the oil price increase in 1973 and 1974. As to the duration of the democratization waves, history has proved both the optimists and the pessimists wrong on democracy, and the future events will probably continue to do so. Formidable obstacles to the expansion of democracy exist in many societies. The third wave, the global democratic revolution of the late 20th century will not last forever. It may be followed by a new surge of authoritarianism, constituting a third reverse wave. That, however, would not preclude a fourth wave of democratization developing something in the 21st century. Judging by the past record, the 2 key factors affecting the future stability and expansion of democracy are economic development and political leadership. On the one hand, the first and second waves had no precise beginnings, no specific causes or universal triggers, and no clear terminal points. However, the third wave, according to Huntington, of democratization in the modern world, implausibly and unwittingly started at 25 minutes after midnight on Thursday, April 25th, 1974 in Lisbon, Portugal, when the radio station played the song Gurandola, Gurandola, Vida Morena. The third wave, according to Huntington, had a precise beginning with a location and time recorded. This is unusual from a theoretical point of view. Precise postulation undermines the virtues of and the consistency of the theoretical explanation Huntington is trying to put forward due to the nature of social change. the multiple factors of social causation that operate simultaneously with varying influence. In other words, we are disputing Huntington's formulation of the theory of democratization. In events that have a theoretical explanation, consistency is essential and part of predictability, the predictability element of the theory. But in social sciences, such precision is nearly impossible to achieve. If two events are caused by the same forces, they should have a degree of resemblance. Otherwise, they cannot be accurately described as predicted. Unfortunately, Huntington's description of democratization through waves falls short of providing us with a theory by which we can predict a single event of democratization, when or where such an event will occur, and the reason why it should occur there. More specifically, Huntington's theory cannot help us to predict whether the NRM regime will collapse due to forces of democratization. The value of a theory is tested by its ability to predict future events. The general critique of Huntington's formulation, therefore, goes not only to the vague concept of a wave through which democratization is achieved on a universal scale, but also to the absence of a major human factor in the process of democratization. This is the idea of social change. Social change can narrow down democratization to a specific political system. In order to understand the democratization process, we must put it in a narrow historical context of social change instead of a universal wave of democratization. Whereas the concept of a wave tends to give the impression of a random process, just as waves in the high seas appear to be, democratization is a conscious human political process in which people participate deliberately in order to achieve specific political results. Huntington seems to be aware of this fact. For example, he says, excuse me, that a democratic regime is installed not by trends but by people. Democracies are created not by causes but by causers. Political leaders and publics have to act. Well, if that is true, then Huntington himself is undermining his own theory. In fact, almost in all cases, democratization is the result of social change. People who are excluded or whose rights are suppressed in the political process for one reason or another, at one point realize the injustice against them and decide to take action to rectify the situation. This social change is often rooted in a denial of human rights. Democratization is therefore inseparable from the movements that emerged from the protection of human rights. Social change creates new values, thereby introducing new forms of behavior and expectations. It is this behavior and the new standards of evaluating it that transforms the political system towards democratization. Huntington's formulation seems to ignore this fundamental fact. In explaining democratization, it is not sufficient to describe the people who carry out the reforms in Parliament. The causes include the minority in the society who protest, who riot, and sometimes shelter the guerrilla fighters. History may help in illustrating this point. Human rights movement, which resulted into democratization of England, for example, may be traced as far back as the Magna Carta, which took place of 1215, in which the King of England was forced by the people to sign the Great Charter, that Magna Carta. At that time, England, they spoke Latin. Everything was written in Latin. In fact, the original copy of Magna Carta is written in Latin. So Magna Carta means Great Charter, recognizing specific rights for the people. These rights included, for the first time, a right of a trial by the jury of one's peers. This was a novel but far-reaching democratization reform which came from the people asserting specific human rights. It was also a rebellion of the people against the corruption within the legal process by the judges and the prosecutors at the time. There was a lot of corruption, very similar to what is going on in Uganda. You may be amazed when you read the conditions in England that prevailed at the time when the people rebelled and said enough is enough. We want to participate in the process. And the king had no choice but to agree to their demand. Hence, the demand for a trial by one's peers to control and limit the power of the judges and prosecutors in the process of administration of justice in England and the English courts of the 13th century. From that time, the ideas of individual liberty of the English men and rule of law, under which the courts curbed the power of the monarchy and the parliament, chipped away the king's prerogatives, gradually blossomed and democratized England. Certainly, from this perspective, we cannot talk about a wave, as Huntington does. The glorious revolution of 1588, which took place 182 years before 1750, the year Huntington identifies to locate the beginnings of the democratization waves, contained important components of democratization of England. It would therefore be a mistake for Huntington to place democratization at a specific date in the 18th century. When liberty is protected, social change is gradual, but occurs at a faster rate because the protection of freedom of association, of assembly and expression propels the changes in society. This is the reason why reforms are introduced and revolutions are avoided when political freedom is protected. Political systems that deny political freedom are eventually changed through revolutionary actions or movements. One can therefore validly conclude and predict that political systems that deny human rights are inevitably subject to political ticking bombs. Ultimately, democratization is about enforcement of human rights that protect political freedom. The prognosis in the specific case of Uganda, based on the theory articulated above, is fair because the opposition against the NRM is growing, not decreasing. Despite the brutal repressive measures taken by the regime against the opposition, people are determined to confront NRM regime. Increasingly, the people are less fearful of the state instrumentalities. No matter how brutal they become. They were very brutal in South Africa, but they were confronted. They were very brutal in Moscow. The KGB was a terror, but they were confronted. In the Arab Spring, those regimes, Gaddafi was a terror, but he was confronted. And Mubarak is gone, and so are the others. Museveni, you will go. This is a predictable under our theory of the democratization. The international community is condemning the repressive actions of NRM. Pressure against the NRM regime is building and inevitable. Democratization of Uganda is predictable. In conclusion, we must reconcile the two conflicting conclusions we have reached about the prognosis under the theoretical section and the prognosis we reached under the chances of democratization under NRM regime. Under NRM regime, we concluded that prognosis was very bad. Under the theory of democratization, the prognosis is very good because social change and political repression will always inevitably be confronted, no matter what. The conflict between the two conclusions is easy to explain. Under theory, the chances of democratization are good because we are saying that what the theory excuse me, I'll repeat this one. Under theory, the chances of democracy are good because we are saying what the theory predicts. Democratization is inevitable under certain political conditions. When human rights are violated, the people inevitably rebel against the regime in order to protect their human rights. And nobody can stop that. And God knows that because He is the one who gave us human rights. However, given the political conditions under which the NRM regime is surviving, and the obstacles the regime has erected in the way, and the corruption, the prognosis is bad because NRM regime is not yet in a position to commit political suicide in order to democratize Uganda. The stakes are too high given the level of corruption within the regime. There is no conflict between the two conflicting conclusions. From a theoretical point of view, democratization is inevitable and imminent given the political conditions existing in Uganda now. What makes the prognosis for democratization bad under NRM regime is the fact that one has to either force the NRM to voluntarily democratize the system, just as South African regime was forced to take the necessary steps to in order to unwillingly abolish apartheid over a period of 30 years, that is between 1960 and Sharpeville Massacre and 1990 when Mandela was released. Meaningful reforms in South Africa came after 1990, but the process that caused the democratization in South Africa had lasted 4 decades. Democratization theory, however, would have predicted in 1960 that the fate of apartheid was sealed. The only question was when the apartheid regime would fall. When the Soweto riots took place in the 1970s, it was clear that South African society was rapidly changing, and the process of reform to recognize the rights of the Africans was inevitable and irreversible. The same can be said today about the NRM regime. It can drag on the process, but in the end, it cannot win the war against democratization of Uganda. Theory has sealed the fate of NRM regime. Politics, however, may keep the process going for a while. That is the end of this conversation today, and I hope that you come back next week when we begin to deal with the specific issues and the Constitution, the 1995 Constitution. We shall begin by looking at the way it was made, the contradictory provisions that were included in the 1995 Constitution, and the basic theory under which that Constitution was constructed, which was the theory, the Museveni's sectarian social theory, which obviously is an invalid social theory. So I invite you to tune in again next Saturday. Hopefully it will be at the usual time at 3 o'clock. And then we shall continue the conversation on democratization of Africa, the case of Uganda in comparative perspective. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to you listening next